A racist police officer poisons a black child's dog, unaware the boy is the mayor's son. What happens next will leave you speechless. Elijah Thomas had always been a quiet boy. At 12, he wasn't the type to make waves or draw attention. He lived in Millstone, a small, sleepy town where everyone knew each other and most people had their routines. His own routine, it seemed, revolved around the one constant in his life, his dog, Rocket. Every morning, like clockwork, before school, Elijah would leash Rocket, a golden retriever with bright eyes and a sprightly step despite his age, and take him on a walk around the block. It was a quiet time between them, just the sound of Rocket's paws on the pavement and the occasional chirp of a bird overhead. It was on these walks that they would always stop at the same corner bakery. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Granger, would always greet them with a smile, handing Elijah a small piece of bread, which Rocket eagerly gobbled up. They were small, simple moments, nothing too special, but it was theirs. It was part of the peaceful rhythm of Elijah's life, a life that, on the surface, seemed so ordinary. What most people didn't know about Elijah, though, was that he was the only son of Mayor Desmond Thomas. Elijah's father was a man of power and influence in the town, though he kept it all low profile. Elijah had never really understood why his father preferred to stay out of the public eye. At school, his classmates were always talking about their parents, about what they did, but when it came to Desmond Thomas, Elijah's answers were always vague. He had been taught to keep his family life private, to not draw attention to who his father was. It was a strange burden to carry, especially when everyone around him was so open about their lives. But Elijah never minded too much. He had Rocket, and that was all he needed. The dog was his companion, his confidant, and for the most part, that was enough. They didn't need anyone else. One particular morning, as they passed the bakery, Elijah saw Officer Granger walking down the street. Officer Granger was a man with a reputation, a long history of racially profiling black boys in the town. Elijah had heard whispers of it from the older kids, the kind of thing that seemed like a distant worry, something that happened to other people. But today, Granger's eyes landed on him, and Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Granger's gaze wasn't just cold, it was venomous. Elijah could feel it, like the air had shifted, like the weight of the man's stare was heavier than it should have been. Granger sneered at him as he passed, muttering something under his breath that Elijah couldn't quite make out. "Keep walking," Elijah told himself, the words barely a whisper. His father had taught him to stay calm, to not engage with the ignorance that sometimes came his way. But even as he turned his back on Granger and walked away, the encounter lingered in his mind. That afternoon, Elijah returned home with Rocket, feeling more unsettled than usual. His father was busy in his office, as he often was, but he had promised Elijah they'd go to the park later that evening. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that seemed to cling to him. He dismissed it, chalking it up to the weird interaction with Granger. It was just a passing moment, right? As the day wore on, something changed. Rocket, always energetic and playful, began to show signs of distress. He wasn't his usual self. He barely touched his food. And when Elijah took him outside, Rocket collapsed, suddenly limp and unresponsive. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside the dog, gently shaking him, calling his name. "Rocket, what's wrong? Please wake up," he begged, his voice trembling. Panic set in as Rocket's body convulsed. He was vomiting uncontrollably, and Elijah could feel his stomach twist into knots. "Dad! Dad!" he screamed, rushing to his father's office. Desmond Thomas, who had been busy sorting through papers, shot up from his chair at the sound of Elijah's voice. His calm demeanor cracked as he saw the state Rocket was in. "What happened?" Desmond asked, his voice sharp with concern. "I don't know, Dad. He's sick. He's not moving." Elijah's words spilled out in a frantic rush. Desmond didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door with Elijah, carrying Rocket in his arms as they drove to the nearest vet. Elijah's hands shook as he clutched Rocket's collar in his lap, his mind racing. At the vet's office, the mood was tense. Elijah sat in the waiting room, his eyes never leaving Rocket, who was lying motionless on the examination table. Desmond stood beside him, his jaw clenched, as the vet worked quickly. "What's wrong with him?" Desmond asked again, his voice more urgent now. The vet looked up from his instruments, her face pale. "I'm sorry, but Rocket, he's been poisoned," she said, her words hitting like a cold wave. "It's a rare compound. We don't see it often, but it's a substance that's used in law enforcement for training purposes. It's not something most people would have access to." Elijah froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you mean? Who would do this?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The vet looked down, shaking her head. "I don't know, but I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. Rocket's gone." A heavy silence fell over the room. Elijah's mind struggled to process the words, to comprehend what had just happened. Rocket was gone. His best friend, the one person who had always been there for him, was gone in a flash, taken by something so senseless and cruel. But there was something else, something about Granger's look earlier that day kept replaying in Elijah's mind. The sneer, the muttered words, the way he'd watched him walk by as if he knew something Elijah didn't. The pieces of the puzzle weren't adding up, but Elijah had a sinking feeling that they weren't just random events. Something was happening, something big, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Granger was at the center of it all. As they left the vet's office, Elijah's mind raced. The world felt colder, emptier now that Rocket was gone. But beneath that grief, a spark of something else was igniting inside him. The feeling that justice had to be done, that Granger had to be held accountable. Elijah had never been the type to speak out, but this was different. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about something bigger, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. As they drove home, Elijah stared out the window, the streets of Millstone stretching out before him like a long, uncertain road. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something darker, and it wasn't over yet. Something was coming, something Elijah could feel deep in his bones, and he was ready for it. The air felt heavier than usual the morning after Rocket's death. The usually peaceful town of Millstone was cloaked in a quiet stillness that mirrored Elijah's own grief. The walls of his room, once filled with the comforting sounds of Rocket's wagging tail and bark, now felt suffocating. His loyal companion, the dog who had been his best friend for years, was gone. And with his death came a creeping sense of unease, a feeling that something sinister had been at play. But it wasn't until later that night, when Desmond received the toxicology report, that the reality of what had happened truly began to sink in. The compound that had been found in Rocket's system was rare, something Desmond knew could only be found in law enforcement circles. It was a substance typically used in narcotics training, an agent meant to simulate the effects of dangerous drugs. Desmond's stomach turned as the implications of the discovery became clear. This was no accident, no random poisoning. Someone had intentionally harmed Rocket, and the only question left was, why? Desmond sat at his desk, the report in front of him, his fingers pressing into the paper as if he could squeeze the answers out. He had seen corruption in his years as mayor, but this was different. This was personal. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settle in his chest. Rocket wasn't just any dog. He had been Elijah's best friend, his protector, and in many ways, his family. To harm him was to harm Elijah, and Desmond wasn't about to let that go unanswered. He took a deep breath and walked into the living room, where Elijah sat on the couch, his eyes red from crying. His son had always been a quiet, introspective boy, but lately, Desmond had noticed a change in him. The grief, though evident, was compounded by something else, a sense of confusion and fear. Elijah didn't understand what had happened to Rocket, not in the way Desmond did. And that was the hardest part. Elijah trusted the world, believed in its inherent goodness, but the death of his dog, his innocent companion, was a wake-up call. "Elijah," Desmond said softly, sitting down beside him. "We need to talk." Elijah didn't look up. He didn't need to. His father's voice was always steady, comforting even in the most trying times. But tonight, there was something else, an edge, a resolve that sent a shiver down Elijah's spine. Desmond placed the toxicology report in front of him. This came back from the vet. Rocket's death wasn't an accident. Elijah. Someone poisoned him. Elijah blinked, trying to process the words. Poisoned. It sounded so clinical, so impersonal, like something that happened in movies, not in real life. He felt his stomach tighten as he looked at the report. A single sentence burned itself into his mind. Substance found is a law enforcement grade narcotic training agent. Who would do that? Elijah whispered, his voice trembling. His hands clenched around the fabric of his shirt. That's what I'm trying to figure out, Desmond said, his voice low. He hesitated, then continued. I need you to think, Elijah. Did you notice anything strange that day? Anything at all? Elijah paused, his mind racing back through the events of that morning. He remembered the usual routine. Walking Rocket down the street, the bakery on the corner, the familiar hum of the world moving around him. But there was something else, something that now stood out with disturbing clarity. I saw Officer Granger, Elijah said slowly, his voice distant as he recalled the encounter. He looked at me funny, like he was angry, and he muttered something under his breath. I didn't think much of it at the time. Desmond's expression darkened, and his jaw tightened. He knew Granger, had known him for years. Granger had been a fixture in Millstone's police department, one whose record was often swept under the rug. Desmond had always been careful to keep things civil between them, especially as a public official. But now, something in the way Elijah spoke, the way he recalled Granger's behavior, it unsettled him. He muttered something? Desmond asked, his voice steady but edged with an urgency Elijah hadn't heard before. What exactly did he say? Elijah furrowed his brow, trying to recall the words. Something like, get out of the way, you little brat. That's all I remember. Desmond's eyes narrowed. He knew there was more to it than that, but he could tell Elijah wasn't ready to talk further. His son had been through enough. Still, the suspicion that Granger was involved, intentionally or not, was growing stronger with each passing minute. Desmond's mind raced with the possibilities. Could Granger really have poisoned Rocket? Could this be more than just an isolated incident? I'm going to need to speak to someone who can look into Granger, Desmond said, his voice calm but firm. I can't go public with this yet. Not without solid proof. Desmond contacted his old friend, Officer Harold Jacobs, a former colleague who had once served under him when he was the public safety director. Harold was known for his integrity, something that had become increasingly rare among the officers in Millstone. Harold agreed to help, but he was clear. Any investigation into Granger would have to be discreet. If Granger caught wind of it, he would bury any evidence that might link him to Rocket's death. As Desmond prepared to send Harold on his way, he noticed Elijah sitting by the window, staring out into the night. His son had always been a quiet observer of the world, taking everything in, processing it in ways that most people didn't. Desmond could see the wheels turning in Elijah's mind, the same way they had when the boy had first noticed something off about Granger. That night, as Elijah lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something he had overlooked. He picked up his notebook, the one he always carried with him, and began to sketch. It was a way to clear his mind, to focus on something simple when everything else felt too complicated. He sketched Rocket, his loyal dog, the one who had always been there for him. And as he drew, something strange happened. His hand moved on its own, and before he realized it, he had drawn something he hadn't intended. In the corner of the sketch, just outside the park where Rocket had collapsed, was a shadowy figure. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. It was Officer Granger. He hadn't realized until now how deeply that moment had been etched into his memory. Granger had been there, watching him and Rocket. Elijah could almost feel the weight of his eyes, the anger that had been simmering just beneath the surface. Elijah set down the pencil, the realization hitting him with full force. Granger had been involved. But how much of this had been planned? Was Rocket just a casualty in a bigger game? His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the sketch. Tomorrow would bring more answers. But for now, all he had was a drawing that felt more like a warning than a memory. The office was dark, save for the glow of the computer screen that illuminated Harold's tired eyes. It was nearing midnight, and the only sound in the room was the rhythmic tapping of keys as he worked his way through Granger's recent activity. Despite the weight of the investigation bearing down on him, Harold remained focused. He had to do this right, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, each click a calculated decision. Granger was no longer just a rogue cop in his mind. He was a threat to everything Harold had sworn to protect. Harold was a man of integrity, one who had served with distinction under Mayor Desmond Thomas in the past. When Desmond had called him for help, Harold had known the stakes. This wasn't just about a poisoned dog. It was about systemic corruption, about the kind of rot that could destroy the town he'd lived in his entire life. Granger had been in the department too long, and as Harold sifted through the records, it became clearer than ever that the officer's actions weren't an isolated incident. There was a pattern, one that went beyond Rocket's poisoning. As he accessed the department's internal system, a cold shiver ran down his spine when he found it. A K9 training chemical had been checked out by Granger 2 days before Rocket died. There was no reason for a patrol officer like him to have access to such substances. Only those directly involved with the K9 unit had the clearance to use those chemicals. A disturbing realization hit Harold like a punch to the gut. Granger had planned this. He had prepared to poison Rocket, and he had done so with purpose. His mind raced, trying to process the enormity of it. The more Harold thought about it, the more the dots connected. Granger wasn't just a bad cop. He was a criminal, and this act was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face as the weight of what he'd uncovered settled in. He knew he had to act quickly, but this wasn't something he could just bring to light without careful consideration. This went deep, deeper than he had initially realized. If Granger was willing to poison a dog, Elijah's dog, no less, what else had he done? And who else was involved? But before Harold could gather his thoughts, a knock on the door interrupted his focus. His heart skipped. No one was supposed to know he was here. He stood up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol he kept hidden in his desk. As he approached the door, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He opened it just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. There was no one there. Confused, he stepped outside, his eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. Then, as if out of nowhere, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway behind him. Harold turned sharply, but before he could react, a sharp pain seared through his side. He spun around, his vision briefly clouded by a flash of white-hot pain, and saw nothing but the flicker of headlights in the distance as a car screeched away into the night. Harold collapsed against the wall, clutching his side. The blood was slow to spill from the wound, but the pain was sharp, overwhelming. His breath came in shallow gasps as he slid down the wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who had attacked him? Why? Was it Granger's doing? He tried to stay conscious, but his head swam as everything around him blurred. A distant part of his brain realized that this was the point of no return. He was no longer just a cop looking into a case. He was a target now, and that made everything much more dangerous. The next morning, the familiar sound of birds chirping outside Elijah's window did little to soothe the knot in his stomach. The day had already started on the wrong foot when he walked into school and immediately felt the cold eyes on him. It was as if everyone knew what had happened to Rocket, but none of them understood the full story. They didn't understand how much it had hurt. They didn't understand how much it still hurt. The hallway felt too narrow as Elijah walked through, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him. It wasn't long before one of the popular boys, Brent, a lanky sophomore who had been picking on him for weeks, shoved Elijah roughly as he passed by. "What's the matter, Thomas?" Brent sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Crybaby's dog is gone." "Huh? That mutt didn't even matter. You just made it up to get attention, didn't you?" Elijah's fist clenched, but he held back. He knew better. He wasn't going to stoop to their level, not like this. With a deep breath, he pushed past Brent without saying a word, His notebook clutched tightly to his chest like it could shield him from the world. But his mind kept returning to what had happened the day before. Granger had been there, right at the edge of the park when Rocket collapsed. His face had been twisted into that sneer, as if he had known exactly what was going to happen next. It wasn't just a random encounter. It was calculated. Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by the bell ringing, signaling the start of class. He shuffled into his first period, feeling every eye in the room on him. Mr. Dunbar, his teacher, noticed right away, his brow furrowing with concern. But Elijah just gave him a small, tight-lipped smile and sat down. He wasn't ready to talk about it, not yet. Desmond was waiting for him at home, his expression as stern as ever. When Elijah entered the house, the air seemed to tighten around him. His father didn't speak immediately. Instead, he motioned to the couch, where he had laid out a series of security camera footage clips. Elijah sat down quietly, the knot in his stomach growing tighter with each passing second. Desmond pointed to the screen. "This is Granger's squad car, just after midnight last night. Notice the way it slows down as it passes by our house." Elijah's heart skipped. He hadn't thought of that, but now, seeing it on the screen, it became undeniable. Granger had been watching them, watching him. "This isn't just about Rocket anymore," Desmond said, his voice low and even. "This is about power, control. And it's becoming clear that Granger isn't working alone." Elijah didn't speak. He couldn't. His mind was spinning. He had trusted the system. He had always believed that the truth would come to light in the end. But now he wasn't so sure. Later that evening, as the shadows outside lengthened and the city began to quiet, Desmond installed hidden cameras around their home. He was taking no chances now. He had seen the threats coming, and he wasn't going to wait for something worse to happen. Every window was secured, every door locked. "Elijah," Desmond said, his voice firm but gentle, "I need you to stay vigilant. This is more than just a town scandal now. It's personal, and they won't stop until they think they've won." Elijah nodded silently. His thoughts drifted back to the sketchbook that lay on the table beside him. He hadn't drawn anything new for days, not since the day Rocket died. But tonight, there was a sense of urgency that he hadn't felt before. Granger's face was burned into his memory, and the quiet intensity of his father's words only solidified the resolve inside him. Something needed to be done. And if no one else was going to do it, Elijah would. The night was heavy with tension as Elijah lay in bed, his mind racing. His father had gone to bed early, but Elijah couldn't sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral even further. And yet, despite everything, the threats, the danger, Elijah felt a strange sense of determination creeping into his bones. The investigation was gaining momentum, but there was still much more to uncover. They were on the verge of something huge, and Elijah knew, deep down, that the pieces were starting to fall into place. Granger would be exposed. But what would happen next? That was the question that lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered. Elijah sat on the porch, the cool night air pressing against his skin, though it couldn't soothe the grief gnawing at him. The hum of crickets filled the quiet, but his thoughts were louder. He clutched Rocket's old, worn collar in his hand, the leather still faintly carrying the scent of his loyal companion. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he wiped them away quickly, determined to stay strong. Every part of him ached with the loss, but he couldn't bring himself to fully collapse into that sadness. Not yet. Not when he knew there was still something he had to do. The anger, the sense of injustice, kept him up, kept his heart racing through the darkness. He pulled the collar to his chest and opened his notebook, the pen in his hand feeling like an anchor, his only tool to make sense of what had happened. The words, though jumbled and raw, poured out in jagged lines, fragments of his grief, his confusion, and his burning desire to see justice served. His thoughts spilled across the pages in scattered sentences, his pen moving faster than his mind could keep up. But even in the midst of his grief, a part of him couldn't help but notice the silence, an unsettling, heavy stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was then that something moved in the corner of his eye, a shadow creeping down the street. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced up. Granger's squad car rolled slowly past his house, headlights dimmed almost to nothing, the wheels whispering on the asphalt. Elijah's stomach twisted. He knew that car, knew the man behind the wheel. His instincts kicked in. His hand, already holding his tablet, shot out and began recording. The screen flickered to life, the green glow casting an eerie hue over Elijah's face. He zoomed in, his breath shallow as the car inched past the house. He could feel the tension rise, his pulse pounding in his ears. Granger didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. But the knowledge of what had happened, what had been done to Rocket, surged inside Elijah like a tidal wave. "Gotcha," Elijah muttered to himself, his voice barely more than a whisper as he held the tablet steady. The car disappeared into the night, but Elijah didn't stop filming, keeping the camera pointed at the empty street until there was nothing left to see. He knew what he had just witnessed wasn't random. Granger was watching him, watching his family, watching for an opening to do something worse. With the video saved, Elijah stood from the porch, his legs shaky as he went inside. He didn't want to wake his father, but Desmond was a light sleeper. He'd be awake by now, even if only for a brief moment before sleep took him again. Elijah found him sitting in the living room, his hands folded in his lap, staring out the window. The faint glow from the street lamp outside cast soft shadows across his father's face. "Dad, Elijah's voice caught in his throat. Desmond looked up, his gaze sharp despite the tired lines under his eyes. "What's wrong, son?" he asked, his voice heavy but calm. Elijah held out the tablet, the screen showing the video of Granger's car passing by. Desmond's face darkened as he took the tablet, his expression shifting as he watched. The silence between them stretched long, too long. Elijah's heart thudded in his chest. Finally, Desmond set the tablet down, his fingers curling into fists. "You did good, Elijah. But we have to be careful. This isn't just about Rocket anymore. This is bigger." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, like he was thinking through every option, every consequence. "I'll handle it from here. You should get some sleep." But Elijah didn't move. "I want to help. I need to. I have to make sure he pays for what he did. To Rocket. To me. To us." Desmond looked at him then, really looked at him. He saw the fire in his son's eyes, the same quiet determination that he had once seen in himself. Desmond felt a tightness in his chest. His son was growing up, and this would be a defining moment in his life. Elijah would never be the same after all of this. "All right," Desmond said, his voice softer now. "We'll do this together." The next morning, Desmond acted quickly. He arranged a private meeting with the city prosecutor, someone he trusted, someone who still had enough integrity left to care about what was right. Desmond knew the prosecutor was hesitant, caught between doing the right thing and the political pressures that could ruin careers. But Desmond was prepared. He laid everything on the table: the toxicology report, Harold's findings, and Elijah's video. Every piece of evidence painted a clear picture. The prosecutor, a man named James Anderson, stared at the documents in front of him, his fingers tapping against the folder. He was a middle-aged man with a neatly combed head of graying hair, his face tired from years of navigating the treacherous waters of local politics. He was one of the few who still believed in justice, even if it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. This is a lot to take in," Anderson said, his voice low. He glanced up at Desmond. "I'll do what I can, but you have to understand, Desmond, this is going to get messy. People will push back." "I know," Desmond said, his tone steady, "but we can't back down. Not this time." At school, Elijah began to notice the subtle changes. Mr. Dunbar, his English teacher, seemed unusually attentive. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes every time Elijah spoke. The teacher never pushed, never asked too many questions, but he always offered a smile, a small gesture, but one that felt like a lifeline. During class, Mr. Dunbar asked Elijah to share his assignment with the rest of the class. It was a piece about Rocket, Elijah's way of processing his grief. As he read aloud, he could hear the words trembling in his throat. The classroom was silent, every eye on him. When he finished, Mr. Dunbar nodded, his voice low and respectful. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Elijah. Takes a lot of courage to put your heart into your work. I know Rocket meant the world to you." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. But then Mr. Dunbar walked over to his desk and, in a moment of quiet solidarity, slipped a small note into his hand. "Stay strong. You're not alone." Elijah tucked the note into his pocket, feeling the weight of it, the small but significant act of kindness. It gave him something to hold onto as the darkness closed in. But that night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, everything shattered. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Desmond rushed to the window, his heart racing. Outside, the window to the living room had been shattered. A brick lay in the front yard, a note tied to it with a piece of string. Desmond's hands clenched into fists as he read the note aloud. "Next time, it won't be the dog." Elijah stood behind him, his hands trembling as the fear he had been holding back finally began to surface. "What does it mean, Dad? What are they going to do next?" Desmond's face was stone. His anger was evident, but there was also a quiet resolve. "They've just declared war, Elijah. But this isn't over." As Desmond called the police, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to escalate. He had no idea what Granger and his allies were capable of, but he was about to find out. And he wouldn't be standing alone. The storm was coming, and Elijah had no choice but to face it head-on. The phone call came in the dead of night, just as Desmond was preparing to retreat to his office for one last look at the reports. His eyes were tired, his thoughts heavy with the mounting pressure of his investigation into Officer Granger. The weight of being a mayor and a father, all wrapped into one, had become nearly unbearable. Elijah was safely at his brother's countryside home, out of reach of the growing dangers back in Millstone. Desmond had made sure of that. But the threat, the sinister note thrown through their window, still gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. The phone's shrill ring shattered the silence, sending a ripple of dread through him. He grabbed it quickly, not needing to see the caller ID to know who it was. "Desmond." Harold's voice was sharp, urgent. "I found something. It's worse than I thought." Desmond sat up straighter in his chair, instantly alert. "What is it?" Harold took a breath before speaking, the words heavy with the gravity of his discovery. "Granger's got a sealed file, something from 5 years ago. A black teenager. Same circumstances as Rocket, pet poisoned, mysteriously. I've been going through the old complaints, and it's clear this was buried intentionally. Someone wanted it to stay quiet." Desmond's mind raced. He'd suspected as much. There had to be more to Granger than just a racist cop, a man willing to go to great lengths to conceal his actions. "We need to get that file, Harold. Now, if Granger's behind this, if he's done this before, we're running out of time." "I'm on it. I'll keep digging. But we need to be careful. Granger's not going down without a fight." Desmond ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts colliding like waves. Granger had already proven he wasn't afraid to threaten his family, to target Elijah. What would he do if he found out Desmond was getting closer to the truth? The feeling in Desmond's gut told him they were walking on a razor's edge. One wrong move and the entire town could explode in chaos. "Keep me posted, Harold," Desmond said, his voice cold and steady, hiding the fear that clawed at him. Before he hung up, Harold's voice softened. "You're not alone in this, Desmond. We'll get him." Desmond placed the phone down slowly, his mind churning. The urgency of the situation was undeniable. He couldn't afford to let this slip through his fingers. Not when so much was at stake. Not when his son's safety, and the future of their town, depended on exposing the truth. Later that evening, as the moonlight filtered in through the blinds, Desmond sat across from a manila folder, grimy, weathered, filled with information that felt like a bomb just waiting to go off. The toxicology report on Rocket's poisoning sat atop the stack, its cold, clinical words still burning in his mind. The compound used to poison Rocket wasn't just any chemical. It was something reserved for high-level law enforcement training. Desmond's mind kept circling back to that. How did Granger have access to something like that? And why target a dog? Why go so far? Suddenly, a knock on the door cut through his thoughts. Desmond's hand instinctively reached for the file, his fingers curling around it as if it was his only lifeline. "Come in," he called out, his voice betraying none of the fear he felt. Harold entered, his face drawn, looking even more fatigued than usual. "We've got a breakthrough, Desmond." Desmond looked up. "What did you find?" Harold didn't sit, but instead walked to the desk and placed a small USB drive on it. "We got access to Granger's home security system. Well, it's what we feared. There are surveillance photos of Elijah. Not just one or two. Dozens. From when he was walking Rocket." Desmond's blood ran cold. His son had been under watch, and not just by the police. Granger had been stalking him. "I don't need to tell you how serious this is," Harold continued, his voice quiet. "We've got the footage, the photos, the evidence we need to take Granger down." Desmond nodded, his throat tight. "Get a warrant. Tonight, we search his house." Harold hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door. "Desmond, there's more. There's a councilman, Clay Morton. He's been protecting Granger. All these years. I found emails. Evidence of it all. It's bad, man." The name hit Desmond like a punch to the gut. Clay Morton, the city council member who had always seemed so clean, so respectable. The man who had stood beside him in public meetings, shaking hands with the same smile he wore for the cameras. A man Desmond had trusted. "You're sure?" Desmond asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes locked with Harold's. "He's been shielding Granger?" Harold nodded grimly. "There's no doubt. I've got the proof. The connections between him and Granger go back further than we realized. Morton's been covering up these incidents for years. He's part of the reason Granger's still walking free." Desmond slammed his fist onto the desk, the shock of betrayal sinking deep. No more waiting. No more secrets. The next few hours were a blur of action. Harold coordinating with the prosecutor, obtaining the warrant, and preparing for the search of Granger's home. Desmond had to act fast, but he couldn't afford to make any more missteps. The stakes had grown higher than he ever anticipated. The tension in Millstone was palpable. People were starting to whisper about the mayor's involvement in the investigation, but Desmond hadn't given them anything concrete yet. He had to be cautious. The last thing he wanted was for the media to catch wind of the full story before they were ready to strike. Harold returned the next morning, his expression unreadable. "We've got it, Desmond. We found everything." Desmond's pulse quickened. "The evidence?" Harold nodded. "The compound, the photos, the files, and, most importantly, Morton's emails. Granger's done. But so is Morton." Desmond's hands clenched into fists. The pieces were finally falling into place. He had the proof. Now he just had to decide how to play it. The media would be watching, waiting for his next move. And when the truth came to light, it would expose more than just one corrupt officer. It would shake the entire town to its core. "I'll handle Morton," Desmond said, his voice a low growl. "We've come too far to back down now." The investigation was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Desmond felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out there, and he would make sure everyone knew it. The room fell into an oppressive silence. Mayor Desmond Thomas stood at the front of the emergency council meeting, a sealed folder clutched tightly in his hands. His face, usually composed and controlled, now betrayed the weight of the moment. His gaze swept over the council members, each of whom sat in stunned silence, eyes flickering between him and the contents of the folder. He had called this session in haste, knowing that the revelations inside it would change everything. Desmond was a seasoned politician, but even he couldn't deny the tension that crackled in the air tonight. His career, the safety of his family, and the town's future were all hanging by a thread. Inside the folder were damning pieces of evidence, proof that Clay Morton, a respected city council member and the mayor's old ally, had been covering up Officer Granger's dark secrets for years. Desmond's hands shook, but only slightly, as he opened the folder, revealing a series of emails, internal reports, and records of witness intimidation. He placed the documents on the table, one by one, each page more incriminating than the last. He could feel the council members' eyes on him, their disbelief thick in the air. "Is this some kind of joke, Desmond?" Clay Morton's voice broke the silence. The councilman's face had turned pale, but he still tried to maintain an air of control, folding his arms across his chest. He wasn't an easy man to rattle, but Desmond could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "It's no joke, Clay," Desmond said, his voice calm but unwavering. He stood tall, his back straight as he addressed the room. "You've been involved in this cover-up for far too long. You've protected a corrupt officer who poisoned my son's dog. My son, who you all know is the one person this town should have protected above anyone else." Clay flinched at the mention of Elijah. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung heavy in the air. Desmond's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve held steady. He had to take this moment. He had to use his leverage, but he wasn't going to let Clay off easy. "Not anymore. You've helped Granger silence witnesses, bury evidence, and most damning of all, you've kept your mouth shut while we've all suffered for your actions," Desmond continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "I'm offering you a choice now, Clay. You can resign quietly, walk away with some semblance of dignity, and allow the law to take its course, or you can stay, and when the press gets involved, when everyone knows the truth, you'll go down in flames along with Granger." Desmond's words landed like a hammer, striking Clay Morton directly in his weak spot, his pride. Clay's eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening into a thin, angry line. The tension was palpable, and Desmond could almost see the gears turning in the councilman's mind. Would he take the offer and save what little was left of his reputation, or would he fight until the end? For a long moment, Clay said nothing, his jaw clenched. The other council members remained silent, their gazes darting from Clay to Desmond. Finally, Clay exhaled, his shoulders sagging, his eyes falling to the table in resignation. He knew he was cornered. There was no way out. "Fine," Clay muttered under his breath. "I'll resign." Desmond nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. I'll have your resignation filed by morning." He didn't smile, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that justice was taking its first step. Clay Morton might have won some battles in the past, but tonight, Desmond had won the war. The council meeting ended soon after, the atmosphere still heavy with the aftereffects of the revelations. Desmond left the room without exchanging another word with anyone. He had made his move, and now it was time to shift focus to the next phase, Granger. The officer's fate was sealed, but Desmond knew it wasn't going to be as simple as a resignation. The pressure was mounting, and Granger was running out of places to hide. Meanwhile, at home, Elijah sat alone in his room, still haunted by the loss of Rocket. He had spent the last few days in a haze, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But there was one thing that kept him going: the memories of Rocket, his faithful companion who had been taken too soon. In the quiet solitude of his room, Elijah began to write. He didn't have the words to describe everything he was feeling, but he knew how to channel it into something meaningful. He opened his notebook, the one that had been with him through it all, and began to write. Rocket's journey. It wasn't just a story about his dog. It was a tribute to the love and loyalty Rocket had shown him, and the strength Elijah was finding in himself, piece by piece. He wrote about Rocket's adventures, their walks around town, and the way the dog had always been there when Elijah needed him most. Each word was a small step toward healing, a way for Elijah to make sense of the chaos that had consumed his life. When he finished, Elijah felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't enough to undo the pain, but it was a start. A small one, but it was his. He stood up, stretching, then walked out of his room and down the hallway to find his father. Desmond was in his study, the heavy weight of the day still hanging around him. But when Elijah stepped into the room, Desmond's stern expression softened. "Dad," Elijah said quietly, holding out the notebook. Desmond looked up from the papers on his desk, his eyes scanning Elijah's face before moving to the notebook in his son's hands. "What's this?" Elijah smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "It's a story about Rocket. I think I'm ready to let go a little." Desmond's expression softened, and he reached out to take the notebook. "I'm proud of you, son. I really am." He opened the notebook, flipping through the pages. He stopped on the last one, reading the final words of Elijah's story. For a moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, he placed the notebook on his desk. "You've turned pain into something powerful, Elijah," Desmond said, his voice thick with emotion. This is something that'll help others. And it's just the beginning." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. The journey wasn't over, but he felt a glimmer of hope. And that was enough for now. Back in town, the resignation of Clay Morton became the talk of the local news. But Desmond knew it was only a small victory. The real battle was still ahead. Granger, now under increasing pressure, had one last move to make. But Desmond wasn't going to let up until he had secured justice for his son, for Rocket, and for the town. As the night stretched on, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change again. He didn't know what it was, but he was ready for it. He had to be. The calm before the storm was always the most dangerous, and Elijah could feel the storm coming. Desmond stepped out of the city hall, his long coat billowing behind him as he made his way across the cracked pavement. The evening air was cool, but the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. The office was behind him now, the endless meetings, the discussions with the prosecutor, and the simmering tension with the city council had all taken their toll. His mind was occupied with thoughts of Elijah, the boy he loved more than anything. Elijah, who had gone through so much, too much at such a young age. His son was strong, but Desmond was weary. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. As he neared his car, parked at the curb near the darkened parking lot, a sense of unease crept into his chest. It was a feeling he couldn't shake. His instincts, honed from years of military service, told him something wasn't right. Desmond paused for a moment, his senses sharpening as the world seemed to slow around him. The soft hum of the streetlights and the distant sounds of the night felt distant, muffled. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he instinctively reached for the concealed weapon holstered under his jacket. It wasn't something he liked to rely on, but in this town, in this moment, he felt the weight of his responsibility to keep his family safe. Suddenly, a shadow darted from behind a nearby pillar, and before he could react, a man lunged at him. Desmond's pulse quickened, but his training took over. He ducked low, pivoting just as the attacker swung a blade in a wide arc. In one smooth, practiced motion, Desmond grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and drove his elbow into the assailant's side. The weapon clattered to the ground. The attacker stumbled backward, but Desmond wasn't finished. In an instant, he was on his feet, hand gripping the man's collar, forcing him against the side of the car. Desmond's breath was steady, his movements precise. He had faced worse, much worse, in his past. The man gasped for air, and Desmond's eyes met his. A look of sheer desperation filled the assailant's face. He wasn't just a random attacker. Desmond recognized him immediately. "Granger," Desmond muttered, his voice low and dangerous. The realization hit him like a wave, but he didn't falter. Officer Granger, the very man whose poisonous actions had shattered his son's life, was now standing before him, weaponless but still a threat. Granger's eyes were wild, his hands trembling in Desmond's firm grasp. His face was pale, the cold sweat of panic glistening on his forehead. You've ruined everything," Granger spat, his voice cracking with fury. "You and your damn kid? You think you can destroy me?" Desmond's grip tightened, not out of anger, but out of necessity. He couldn't afford any more distractions. Not now. He needed to end this once and for all. "I didn't ruin anything," Desmond replied evenly, his voice controlled but with an edge. "You did this to yourself, Granger. You poisoned a boy's dog, my son's dog, And now you've escalated it to something much worse. You've threatened my family. You've crossed a line that I won't let you come back from." Granger's lips curled into a bitter sneer. "You don't know what you're up against, Desmond. This?" He gestured vaguely at their surroundings, the tension thick in the air. "This is nothing. You're just a damn politician. You think you can beat me? You can't win this fight." The words hung in the air, heavy with malice. But Desmond wasn't listening anymore. His hand went to the gun holstered on his belt, and with practiced ease, he drew it out, keeping it low and steady. He placed the muzzle against Granger's chest. Granger froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "I've already won, Granger," Desmond said, his voice cold now, like ice forming over a once warm fire. "You're done." Desmond held Granger in place, his body rigid, every muscle taut with focus. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, just as quickly, Desmond released the pressure. He stepped back and leveled the gun at Granger's chest, the authority of his stance undeniable. Granger's eyes flicked nervously between the weapon and Desmond's face. He knew he had lost. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the air, and the flashing lights of a squad car lit up the empty street. Desmond didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The authorities were here, just as he had planned. The moment was over. Granger's fate was sealed. Granger's face crumpled in defeat, his earlier defiance fading into a cold, hollow emptiness. "You think they'll believe you?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "You think anyone will care?" "I don't need anyone to believe me," Desmond replied. "The truth will take care of itself." The sirens grew louder as officers rushed to the scene. Granger was quickly handcuffed and shoved into the back of the patrol car. The cameras, hidden along the street, had caught everything. The footage would be all over the news by morning, and there would be no denying what had happened. No one would ever question what kind of man Granger was again. Desmond had made sure of that. As the patrol car sped off into the distance, Desmond felt the weight of the moment. He hadn't just taken down a rogue officer. He had taken down an entire network of corruption, one that had been festering in the town for years. But he wasn't done yet. The fight for justice was far from over. This was just the beginning. Back at home, Elijah sat in the living room, staring at the TV with wide eyes. The scene unfolded before him. The very moment that had felt like a shadow hanging over them was now being broadcast for the whole world to see. Desmond could see the mix of emotions that played across his son's face. There was relief, yes, but there was also something else, something Desmond knew well. It was the sorrow of knowing that the world wasn't always fair, that even when you did everything right, sometimes it still hurt. Elijah turned to his father, who had entered the room quietly. "It's over, isn't it?" Elijah asked, his voice small, fragile. Desmond nodded, though the truth was far more complicated. "It's just beginning," he said, his tone resolute. "There's still a lot of work to be done, but we're going to get through it. We've already started." As the news continued to play, Desmond's gaze lingered on his son. Elijah had been through more than any child should. But now, Desmond could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, Desmond felt that maybe, just maybe, the town was starting to change. It wasn't just about justice for Rocket anymore. It was about creating a future where kids like Elijah didn't have to suffer, where they didn't have to live in fear. But Desmond knew it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't be fast. The damage had been done. But tonight they had taken a step toward healing. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that moment, they had won. And for Elijah, that was enough for now. In the months following the exposure of Officer Granger and the dark underbelly of corruption that had plagued Millstone, the town underwent a quiet yet profound transformation. Mayor Desmond Thomas, still driven by the memory of the pain his family had endured, began a reform campaign that would leave a lasting mark on the town's history. His first step was to push for an independent review of the entire police department. Officers who had been complicit in shielding Granger found themselves investigated, and some were quietly removed from their posts. The officers who had stood by, unwilling to speak out or act, were now facing their own scrutiny. There was no room for silence anymore. Every lead was followed, every file that had been buried was opened, and the truth began to spill out in waves. Desmond's efforts reached beyond just the police force. He demanded an in-depth investigation into the financial dealings of city council members, with Clay Morton at the center. The hidden finances and shady deals that had kept Morton in power for years were uncovered one by one. The media latched onto the story, painting Morton as the puppet master behind a network of corruption that had touched every aspect of Millstone's leadership. The once proud councilman tried to spin his resignation as a personal choice, but it was clear to all that he had been forced out. The town began to feel a shift in the air, a change that was long overdue. But through all of this, the face of the movement was not Desmond. It was Elijah, the young boy who had been thrust into the heart of this turmoil, who had lost everything he held dear, was now the beacon of hope for Millstone. His grief had turned into a quiet strength, and through it, he became the voice of a generation tired of being ignored. His book, Rocket's Journey, was the catalyst for this change. What had started as a means of coping with the loss of his beloved dog had turned into a message of resilience and transformation. Elijah had written the story with raw emotion, pouring all of his pain and love into each page. It was a story of loyalty, love, and justice, a story that touched the hearts of everyone who read it. When Mr. Dunbar, the teacher who had always supported Elijah, suggested they try to get the book published, neither of them expected it to take off the way it did. Local bookstores were the first to carry it, and soon word of mouth spread. The story of a boy who lost his dog to the cruelty of a corrupt officer resonated deeply with the townspeople. Elijah's simple yet powerful words brought comfort to those who had long suffered in silence. The book became a symbol of the fight against injustice, and with every copy sold, more people began to ask questions about the darkness that had been lurking in their own town. Then the unthinkable happened. A national news outlet picked up the story. It wasn't long before Elijah was invited for an interview. Desmond, ever the protector, was hesitant. He didn't want his son to be thrust into the public eye any more than necessary. But Elijah insisted. "I want to do this, Dad," he said quietly one evening, his eyes filled with determination. "Rocket didn't give up on me. I won't give up on him." Desmond, seeing the strength in his son's eyes, knew it was time. He gave his blessing. The interview was broadcast live. Elijah sat in front of the camera, his posture poised, his face still young but marked with the weight of everything he had experienced. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist, looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Elijah," she began, "you've gone through something most people can't even begin to understand. How did you find the strength to keep going after losing Rocket?" Elijah's gaze didn't falter. He looked straight into the camera, as though speaking to every person watching, every person who had felt small or powerless. His voice, steady and clear, broke the silence. "Because Rocket never gave up on me," he said, his tone resolute, "so I won't give up on him." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The interviewer's eyes welled up, but she quickly regained her composure, nodding in silent admiration. The interview made waves not just in Millstone, but across the country. Elijah's words became a rallying cry. People from different towns, different states began reaching out, sharing their own stories of injustice, of corruption, and of perseverance. Elijah's pain had become a mirror for others, and they saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. The book, Rocket's Journey, went on to become a national bestseller, its message of love, loyalty, and standing up for what's right resonating with a wide audience. As the days went by, Desmond watched his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. He had always known that Elijah was special, but seeing him carry the weight of their family's journey, of the town's healing, was something else entirely. He had always believed that the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, but seeing Elijah stand in front of that camera, calm and unbroken, filled him with an overwhelming sense of hope. Yet, with all the victories, the fight was far from over. Millstone had begun its healing process, but the wounds of years of corruption and racial tension couldn't be healed overnight. Desmond knew that true change would take time, But he also knew that the town had already taken its first step in the right direction. They had faced the darkness, and they were emerging into the light. At school, Elijah returned to a different atmosphere. The same classmates who had once taunted him now greeted him with nods of respect. One of the boys who had shoved him in the hallway pulled him aside one day and said, "I'm sorry, Elijah. I was wrong." Elijah simply smiled, a quiet acknowledgement of the change in the air. It wasn't just the students who were changing. The town itself was transforming, shedding its old skin of silence and fear. But just as the winds of change were blowing through Millstone, something unexpected happened. Late one night, as Desmond and Elijah sat together in their living room, a brick came crashing through their window. It landed with a thud on the floor, the shattered glass scattering like 1,000 tiny pieces of the past. Attached to the brick was a note. "Next time, it won't be the dog." Desmond's heart sank as he read the words, but Elijah, his face steady, simply said, "We've come too far to stop now." The threat was chilling, but it only fueled the fire inside Desmond. He knew that the forces trying to hold Millstone back wouldn't stop, but neither would he, and neither would Elijah. The boy they had once tried to silence had become the very voice of change, and nothing, no threat, no danger would stop them now. They had begun a revolution, and it was just getting started. The months that followed saw a continued push for accountability. Granger's trial became a national spectacle, and the public demanded more. Desmond's reform campaign continued to gather steam, but Elijah, despite his fame, remained humble. He continued to share his story, not for the accolades, but because he knew it mattered. He had given a voice to the voiceless, and that was a gift no one could take away from him. As the year drew to a close, Millstone stood as a testament to the power of resilience. A town once filled with corruption and fear was now a place where truth and justice had taken root. And at the heart of it all was a 12-year-old boy named Elijah Thomas, whose story would inspire generations to come. In the end, it was not the dog that had been the symbol of strength. It was Elijah, his quiet courage, his unyielding love for the truth, and his refusal to give up on those who had been wronged. And as Desmond looked at his son, he knew that no matter where the future took them, they would always have each other. Their journey was far from over, but they had already changed the world. And that was just the beginning. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight issues of racial injustice and abuse of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage meaningful discussions about justice, equality, and accountability in law enforcement.